On September 29, 2019, Jimmy Timentwa, a Methow tribal descendant, gave a presentation at the Methow Valley Interpretive Center located in Twist, Washington. Jimmy brought a trunk with him that had not been opened in 30 years. It held 2 buckskin jackets, one beaded, one plain, an elaborate beaded vest with an array of plain and beaded buckskin gloves, all made by his mother Julianne Timentwa. Jimmy is a gifted storyteller. His stories reach back generations through his father, mother, grandparents, and others from the Methow band. Jimmy ranches the family allotment in the range on the southwest corner of the Colville Reservation. He has raised hay and cattle there for his whole life in a rough landscape of sagebrush, rock, and alkali. This is the first time Jimmy has presented his story to the public. If you listen carefully at the end of the talk, you can hear Glenn Schmekel, a board member of the Interpretive Center, making the comment that Jimmy's talk and other presentations offered by the center are a culmination of years of dreaming and hard work. Thanks to Glenn and Carolyn Schmekel and all the dedicated volunteers for all their time and energy to make the Interpretive Center what it is, a place of cultural and historical education and celebration.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, my mother is Julianne Timentwa, and with the printouts that you have from the Interpretive Center, this is her on the right side. On those horses are the picking baskets, and this rope that's hanging here is made out of horsetail. That's how they traveled over from the Okanagan to here. And a lot of these horses were hooked from head to the next saddle horse, and they came over in caravans of horses, sometimes 6, 7 horses in pack teams. A lot of times they came over in wagons. This Methow Valley for us, or for me, because I drove my mother around for a good many years. I mean, she wanted to come here for many years because this is where she grew up. We started at the Methow, or the mouth of the Methow at Pateras. That has a very emotional breaking up here, and I didn't want to, because where Watson Draw is now, up the road, this is an old auntie. Well, she's talking about 2 generations before her. She died in a Methow, and they transported her home, and they could not get her to Chilliwack to bury her. And it was in the summertime, and the body started to swell up, so they buried her along the Columbia. And we mark it by a grove of trees, but the trees aren't where he's buried because of the Aswell Dam. We use that area basically because when they drop the water down, we can see the peninsula, but we searched for, we didn't search for her, but a John Thorpe that worked for Douglas County PED sent anthropologists out to search for the body. They could not find her, so she's out there. The Watson Draw also made it so we could enter the Methow Valley. That's by trail. The Watson Draw has an Indian name, but over the years, it's been lost. We use the word Hawith, where my mom did. It means a trail by a creek. That trail drops over to what is now probably Black Canyon area. We've asked a lot of people if they remembered the name. We called Drew Miller, or she did, and said he did not remember the name. So that name has gone into the eons. Another thing we liked was they went in the years before. We're talking, my mother's telling me this is when her grandparents traveled. They went down to Billy Tom's place. That was his dad's place. It was Pino Tom, the father. They used to gather there, and they would travel to Chelan. And I'd drive my mom to Chelan because we visited the Wapatu family. There was a family connection. And I would see these Salisbury says he dropped into Chelan, and they says, we came down here in April to pick these. These are the early varieties. And I'm going, you came all the way down here. And she says, we left Uncle Billy Tom's place. And I'm thinking, you traveled 40 miles by road. She says, no. You go across from Elta Lake and you drop into Antwain Creek, then you're there. You're only talking a day's ride. And I says, how did you go? She says, well, I went by horse or we went by wagon. I says, well, how do you travel that? She says, we go, because a horse travels the canyon, or the wagon, you travel the ground according to how you can maneuver it. And I went, oh, all right. That kind of went over my head. And that's the reason we went down there. And not only that, Sally Michele was my grandmother, my mother's mother from this area. Her mother tells of a story that they would float down the Methow, and by Pateras, it's long gone now, those pinnacles. They stood out of the river. My great-grandmother's job and her mother was to hold that boat against those pillars while the husband speared fish. Then when they got the varieties, they would come back. That's another attraction we have there, other than the dead and people would live there. And my mother was told a story. They said when life got bad here, people would travel by boat. And they'd travel the Columbia until they got to Antioch. The river back when they had the dams here, the water made a turn and there was rapids. There was a depression in the river. Now, this is something we will never know again, is that they made nets out of, we call it speechin, but you would call it wild hemp that grows around the river. And they would weight it with rocks. And when they got down to that depression, they would let the net in the river. And I said, how long? She says, net. I said, okay, you don't question an old person because they'll shut up. And they would drag it in the net, and they would go, if you're going down river, they went to the left side, and that's where they took care of the fish before they came up. And I said, why? And they said, because Chief Antioch lived on the other side of the river. If you went there, he wanted half the fish or all of it. So you went to the other side, and you took care of it, and you came home. And that's the deal with us. And as a young girl, she would come up and as I got older, we were in here in April, May, June, July, October. I mean, not 1 year, but every year. And I drove my mother, and there's 5 different types of Salisbury bushes. They grow in different areas. And the latest one grows up at Goat Wall. And you pick it at the end of October. And they're very sparse on that tree. I mean, this tree is nothing but a scrub bush. And my mom says, I want to pick that. And I'm looking at that and I go, there ain't enough berries there to fill up a cup. And here we're out here in cold weather like this, freezing, picking this scarcely thing. And she says, this is the most valuable berry in the world because it's the last berry. Anyway, I dismissed that as... We came up this valley, and along the way we came up, the H tributary had somewhere you could gather food from bitterroots to carrots to everything growed at different altitudes. And as they came up the valley, these tributaries did something. For an example, up the Chewach, you call it the Chewach, we call it the Chewach. There's wild raspberries that grow up there. After the last fires up there, some of it's been destroyed, but there are still a few there. But we ended up traveling all the way up to what is now Mazama. There's a camp yard there, a campground. There's a tree that stands out there, and that's where we always camped. That's where Mom said, we're going to camp. The reason was it was a family attraction. She grew up there, and when you're a child, you have childhood dreams. You think they're memories. For me, I have memories of campfires coming through the tent, and I'm going. You might think you're imagining things, but these are your childhood memories. And she said that she remembered being there. She had a great uncle that made boats, or the canoes. And we use the word mi'is. It's the Latin term, as we found out later on, was blue spruce. She says that's where her great-grandfather made the boats. And that's what the name of that place is. It's a place of making a boat. And as we were camping there, we was always listening to these stories that where Don Campion now lives, I had the opportunity to go with my sister and the basket group. We were allowed to go in there to get cedar roots because for years that was private ground. You couldn't trespass, go in. I was very lucky to go in there, and because my mother told me, as we're standing there looking in that area, she says, "You'll never see it in your lifetime." He says that meadow had teepees in rows. They camped there, the people gathered there. And my mother says, I never saw it, but she says, you will never see it. Campfires are burning. It's the only artificial light there. The valley changes. And you're talking rows of teepees. And I thought this, and I walked across that meadow. I abandoned the diggers, and I went across that meadow. And I'm 100 years late. There's no evidence of camps. See, I'm going by stories that I heard 100 years ago. And that's why that area is very special to us. And years later, we had a man, his last name is Jim, first name was Charlie. My mother said I knew this man, but I'm too young to remember. And this man hung around us, and I think he was dying. That's why he was around. And my mother and him traded stories of how, when, where they grew up. We came up here, and when he came with us, I did not remember who he was. To me, when you're a child, you're just another old person, you just, got to fetch and clean after this old guy, But anyway, to make the story short, in that campground, when you're there and the fire's burning, that's what I mean when I have these memories. And the firelight's coming into that tent, and as you're sleeping, the ground's not the easiest thing to sleep on. And you're waking up all hours of the night because it's uncomfortable. It ain't like home. You got bed, here it's on the rocks. And I'd wake up and I'd see somebody tending that fire. And after a while, I'd wake up because you can't get comfortable on the ground. And somebody else would wake up, and I'd sit there and there's somebody else tending the fire. And I wondered why. Never did ask that question because I didn't dare. And towards daylight, when it cracks, daylight starts cracking, everybody goes to bed. And this is a story that Charlie Jim told me. And it was probably something, and my mother said, this is what he was trying to tell you. And this was years later. It says, Charlie was trying to tell you of the day that went by. This does not exist anymore. In Charlie's day, he was telling of this country where fish came up the river. And his words, he says, the fish came up the river. You could hear them coming. It's like you throw rocks in the river. They came up in schools. That's before the dams. And as a child, they were sent to go fishing. The willow that grows, well, you wouldn't recognize it. It's that white willow that grows along the river. It's got a white bark and white. It's very flexible. Charlie told us they used to build what they called a mulaman. It's what after he constructed, it would look like when you catch a fish, you got that fish net. That's what he's trying to build. You get a willow and you bend it in a circle. And as it comes together, you peel the bark off the willow. It's a universal plant. and you can tie the willow around that limb, and you build the top of it, or the rim. Then you build the hoops that go around, you go around it one way and you loop it the other way, and you build a scooper. And their job as a teenager was to go out into the creek. And I couldn't get this, and my mother said, I says, you're going to scare fish away. She says, no, because this is how the laws of the land treats people. You take that mulliman and you go into the creek and you put it in the river. The fish aren't going to get scared of you because it's going to smell the willow. He swims along the creek smelling that plant. So he's not going to get scared. And when that fish you need to catch, you scoop it out of the river. And I says, well, scooting back and forth in the river, you're splashing. They says, no, you cut a limb with a fork on it. You wrap it around you and use the bark again to tie it. Then for every fish you get, and Charlie would laugh, and he says, you put it on, that fish is flopping, and you're waiting for the next one. And when you got enough for dinner, because we had to, it isn't like we run down to Hank's and get something to eat. Back in the day, you had to harvest what you got. It was 24 hours a day to eat. You spend your lifetime digging, hunting, fishing. I mean, if you didn't, you started out. But anyway, when you got through with it, you hung it in a tree. Then when you got through in that, you didn't camp in one particular area and stay there. We was always moving. Natives did not camp in one area. And when you took that limb off, when you got ready to leave, an elder would say, go take care of it. So what you did, you went down to the tree and you put the mulliman into the river, and as Charlie would say, you wash the fish smell off. You disassemble that mulliman and you lay these limbs out along the river. So the tree's there, the fish come back. You're taking from nature, but you're giving back. While we was there, my mother said that went up there to early winters, that was the entrance to Robinson Creek, Lost Creek. And back in the day, there was a man that, I don't know if he was a headhunter or leader or what he was, but he was the man that hunted. And he injured his leg, and the right leg was stiff. Well, we would say chook, meaning stiff. And this old man, everybody was wondering, as my mom and dad would say, we were curious, how did this handicapped individual get on with that stiff leg? He said we would watch him, and as we were distracted, he would get on, and he was a horseback. This picture, this individual to the left, that is him. This is the man they call Hashmula. This is him, and if you look in it, he has the gauntlets on. He has the beaded vest on. And what I didn't bring was the material that was on the horse. So I'm telling you, this shows that these items are contemporary, but they are the same as they were 100 years ago, and possibly 200 years ago, because mother taught daughter. So this style is not gone. But that was his job, was to lead hunters. And my dad came in this country, and he wasn't from this area. He married into this country. And they went hunting a goat. And this goat is extinguished. It does not exist anymore. And he went up here with a Charlie, a Bernard Charlie was his teenage friend, and another one was a Joe Harry. And their job was to hunt this goat. And they left the Robinson Creek area, and they went up in the mountains. And my dad said those mountains were so rugged, because he came from the Okanagan. We got rolling hills over there. We don't have these majestic mountains you do. And the mountains were so steep, he said, they were so sharp, he says, my horse would be on one side and the other. And we traveled that country for days, and my dad would say to Hashmula, there's those goats. And he'd say, no, and he'd say, look, I don't want, and Lutin Hamin, I want, he said, come. What he's saying, I don't want that goat. I want another. He says they went a day or two or whatever, and he says they came out into the Poseidon. He said it opened up. An Indian's talking, and he says it opens up. It's not rugged, it's open. In there was a goat that was bigger, thicker than the mountain goat. And they didn't grow, they didn't have many in that herd. They were most prized because that hide could make a coat, a blanket. And years later, Bernard, Charlie, and my dad went in there looking for that goat. They looked, and they finally thought they were in the same area. Then they found that there was a forestry ranger going through with horse and pack horse, and said, where are these? And he says, they've been hunted to extinction because of the gold miners in the Poseidon. So that particular goat, you ain't going to see again. And it was some years, maybe the same year or sometime later, they finally went hunting for the real bully goat because they were in search of those horns. They were very prized. They used some spoons, bowls, that buckhorn. The bigger, the better. That's what they wanted. So Hashmula, the man in the picture that's in your printing here, is the leader that took him up there. This man on the corner here is Hashmula. In reality, this woman and this man is a generation apart, but somehow my mother and him are related. Because when my dad married into the family, it was kind of taboo to have foreigners, other tribal members. It was kind of frowned on. Hashmula was kind of sponsoring him. He was somebody who wanted to show him where the trails, and so he didn't get lost or hurt. That was Hashmula's job, I guess, in a way. Anyway, they went hunting up Robertson Creek for a real, buckhorn sheep. And they got up there. They took days to get up there. They went out there, and my dad said, that was an experience you wouldn't believe. He says, you're on mountains that, the wind's blowing. He says, you think you're going to be blown off there. And he says, we watched this. He says, the only reason I went out in that ridge chasing that billy goat was because Hashmula, with that stiff handicap, went out there like it was out here in a flat. He says, we couldn't stand being up that high. He says, we're 4,600 feet elevation. And he says, these mountains go forever. Joe Harry went out maybe 50, 60 feet, and there was a rocky juttation standing up. And he says, he couldn't stand the altitude, so he tied himself on. He said, the only reason I went out there, he says, that old man was my, I guess you would say, tutor, and he says, I was not going to, make him ashamed of me. So he says, I followed him out there, and he says, that man was walking on a ledge no wider than your foot. And he says, that's why we was after. They wanted this goat because his ability to be on that rocky wall. They get out there, and he says, Hashmula is tied out in this little partition of rock. He's standing out there like it's on your porch, and we're up. He says, the wind, he says, felt like was going to blow you off. And Hashmula says, give me your gun, or take your gun and shoot this goat. My dad says, I can't. He says in Indian, push. What he's saying, he says, I'm stuck to the rock. I ain't getting off this rock. It's a long ways down. So Hashmula had to come to him and actually take the rifle off. And he said he had to actually take my hand off the rocks and stick it back on. And he says, Hashmula shot this goat. And my dad said, I watched that goat fall down. It bounced from rock cliff and bounced. And he said, now we have to go down after that damn thing. And he says, and Hashmula came back and he says, I'm going to keep your gun and I'm going to go down. I'm going to go after that goat because you can't leave it. You can't just shoot it and leave it. So he said to my father, you guys go back. And he said, it took us quite a while to get back to Joe Harry, and he's tied to the rocks. We get him untied. And he said, we'd look down, he says, Hashmula, I mean, he's an old man and he's got a handicap. He's down that cliff. So he says, we finally get back and we go clear around, and Hashmula, before he tells where they leave, he says, look across the country, mark this country. You see this point, you see that point, that way. I'm going to be down there. So when you go around, you're not going to lose me. And he says, we went down and the horses are sliding down as best as we could. And they get down there. And the only reason they found Hashmula was he built a fire out of dry wood, and he would throw ferns on it to send up smoke so you could smell where he was. And he got there and he says, that old man had that goat already dressed and ready for trail. And we're looking at him like, how in the hell did he do this? But, he had a handicap. And my dad looked up and he goes, oh, because you ever been up in those Robinson areas? It's like, holy. But yeah. Same year, somewhere else, they went from here and they went behind. They crossed the Chouach and they came out up here behind Parridge, and they ended up out there in the ridges. They were looking for a different deer. It was bigger, fatter. Because another thing, Hashmona says this country's not hunted that way. Nobody likes this country. It's high and it's thicket. My dad was still kind of considered an outsider. I mean, he was married he was from the Okanagan. He wasn't one of them. You know how it's the outlaw, or the in-law outlaw. He was still considered an outlaw, even though he was an in-law. And anyway, he ended up going with that old man, and he said, we got in that country, and that country up there is so thick with trees. I mean, just, you couldn't see your hand through them. And my dad says, I was riding this thoroughbred horse because him and Joe Harry and Bernard Charlie were raised in the Okanagan, where we're around horses all the time. They ride horses. I mean, they would rope wild horses and break them to ride. I mean, that's their livelihood. And he was up there, and every bunch of cows or sheep or horses, you got this one numbnut. And this horse, I mean, this thing will run just to run. I mean, he's got his head up and he's taking a whole herd with you, and they're running. I mean, this numbnut ain't worth the powder to blow him up. I mean, you can chase them until they run into rock walls. They'll slam into them, back off, and look at it like, where did this come from? I mean, these are the things that are the most stupidest critters on earth, and they're leading a bunch, and they're doing it at a run. I mean, they're the flat covered ground. Well, anyway, they turned out a horse out there, and they couldn't catch him. And my dad says, well, it ain't my business. So he kind of hung back. And the horse, they were trying to catch it out there, and that thing would run wherever. And he says, well, you better catch this thing. And he says, well, he saw he had a chance to do it. So he went through the thicket, and he had a rope, and he roped that horse out in the thicket. He says, I'm going to teach this horse some manners. So he roped that horse, dallied up. And when he took the slack out, the horse went down, and he calmed that horse down after he got off and led it back to Hashmula and says, here's your horse, because he was an outsider. Everybody, thought. But that night and everybody after that, people looked upon him a little differently because he could show that he was not an ordinary Joe, I guess. But that's the area that we lived in this area here. And with that willow, there's a picture down at the lower part of this thing. It says from the Interpretive Center here that you have printed out. This is a fish trap at the bottom. This is a fish trap that goes across that is consisted of poles, and when the mats that are buried in the water are made out of willow. But there's a hole in here that lets the fish go up and down. The U.S. fishery hatchery said that these stop the flow of fish. And in the later years, these fish traps The game warden hired individuals and they floated down with dynamite charges and blow these up. And you never see these in the river again. And with my interpretation of this and looking down, it has swift water beside it, and that tells me it's not the Okanagan, it has to be the Methow. And the species of trees, because you see forest trees, and because of my mother speaking, there's only 2 locations of the fish, because she had an uncle that had one of these. And because of the species that you see in the picture, and because it is on the left side entrance, her uncle Tai would be entered on the left side because it's farther upriver. With me looking at this and with that information, I would say this is Hazel Burke's fishing trap. And if you go out the street, you go down Main Street, you drive down to the park, and you go to the south end of the park, you will see this green trees and the forest trees. That famous salmon trap stretched across the river to those rock walls. Not quite an hour. Watching the clock, and I shouldn't be. There are a lot of things that have gone into the bygone area because at Pipestone Canyon, we, not my family, but again, Hazel Burke was one that told stories of how her people would make pipes and different items. And Elaine and I drove her up there years ago. Elaine had a white Dodge van and she says, they'll make it up there. We took this Hazel up there, and she stood there and said, this country has changed. I haven't been here in a number of years. And she wanted rocks, and we went down there, and there's a fence across it. You no longer can travel by car, you can walk. So I went down that canyon a ways, and she says, I want rocks off the hill that are just getting to where they're just getting weather beaten and broken loose. And she says, I want those. And I'm going, this August is full of snakes. But bravery all of a sudden succumbed me, so I skeeted up there and brought her a few pieces. And she said, too many years, too many years. She says, I don't think I could fix it again. The people before us, we called them Schmekel, and the word that we're using meaning older people. These people, we don't know who they are. My ancestors said, we don't know who they were, but they were here before us. By that, they said, be careful of going up these valleys because these are the buried areas of these people. Or they're these homes, that's where they once lived, the underground dugouts. This outside the building here with me and Bruce and a number of other people that are on the concept. My grandma Rosalie Timentwa was also told, she says, when they gave dances, they danced underground. So Hazel made a panorama of one as best she could remember. And it's a 4-post standard, so if you measure out 16 feet, it was 75 by 50 buildings, but they're underground. And the people back in the day used to dance for Chinook dances. They were asking, like say this year would have been an example. The winter held on forever. It lasted and lasted, just got colder and colder, wouldn't break. They would go down and they would dance down in these underground buildings, or we do it now in structures, but I think we've lost the ability to do it. But we're asking for the south winds to come. They're called shlawelas, warm winds. If you look on the TV, they say a desertly warm flow is coming with winds. That's what that's what they're asking for, is these desert winds to get rid of the snow. And I would see my parents, because on the ranch we're doing work and we're out there all. When you got cows, you get to hating them things by May and February, March, because you're feeding them all the time, take care of them. You go, man, there's other things to do, but you keep doing it. I mean, that's For a number of us people, we fell in love with a shovel full of dirt and a swayback cow. It's just what you prefer. I mean, this is what you are, I guess. But anyway, when I'd see my parents, the winds would come and they go, oh, chlawala, chlawala, kitchen. They start bouncing. They're asking for that wind to blow. Let's take the snow off. And it'd quit and they'd get mad. You're not good enough, and they'd make fun of it, hoping it would get stronger. And that was something I remembered. And when the wind started blowing like that and picked up, you could smell rain on the air. And for me, I can see Dyer Hill, which is 20 miles away. And you see these black clouds coming in. Rain's coming. With the warm wind blowing and the rain, it's going to take the snow off. We're out of winter. They would go to the trees at the house and they'd break off a lemon. And they'd turn around and they'd look at those, face those rain clouds. And they'd poke that. They're trying to make it rain. And now it's me on the front of the side, standing on the side of the tractor, feeling that south wind blow. I'm going, let's get out of it. Let's dry up, get off this road. And I'd see these clouds coming, and you'd pick up the pitchfork. You want things to change because that was kind of like a religion. And they were praying for these warm winds to come. It bared off the hillsides. Back in the day, it let the deer get out there. And the deer meat were so soft because they're trying to survive. Here they can get out there and pick up a little bit of green grass and the meat gets firmer. Lakes and the rivers lose the ice. The fish aren't soft no more. And it exposes the early starvation foods. We call it sunflowers. And they grow plentiful. If you go to Winthrop and you see that hillside that's full of sunflowers. And these were like the starvation foods where they would grab the leaves of the pods of the plant and they would jerk it loose and expose a new growth. And some of them were big as your finger. And they'd probably be 8 or 9 to a pod. They would take and pick them off and put them in a bucket, eat them the way they were, or they mixed them with other foods. These were the early starvation foods that you were glad to see when you got them. And that sunflower plant, as it matured, before it got the yellow plant on it, my mom and dad would do it, and they would get on the hillside and they'd break off plants and they would peel the bark. It's like celery, but it's wild. And later on, when the seeds of the pots got dry, my mom and the women would go out there with beaters and with an apron, they would catch those seeds off the sunflowers. And they would put it in now they use a steel container, but before they used a bowl, and they would make miktu. They would pound that sunflower seed to a flour. They either mixed it or ate it the way it was. You didn't go out like a lot of people. They hunt with a pickup till they fill it. In my country, I see it. They hunt deer to extinction damn near. Well, they are. They fill up a pickup box and they go home and they feed dogs. You see, wintertime, they run them down with snowmobiles. This man in this picture would take my dad out and he'd say, we're going hunting. Again, I would identify him as Hashmulet. He would take my dad and a number of hunters out, and my dad says, we're going hunting deer. He says, yeah. As he's riding along, he would sing a ditty. He's asking a deer to take pity of him. And the deer, as you go along, one of the deer will come out and stand in front of you. We see people now shooting, and I hunt horseback, and I've shot a lot of deer with the smallest rifle in the world. I don't need an AK-47. I don't need an automatic. I can use a single-shot 22, But I don't hunt much because wildlife, man, something that's, well, look at me. I've got buckskin. I mean, I'm using the skins of them. Yeah, that's a life that is now, wildlife is getting extinct. I am running out of gas, and I got 10 more minutes. Yeah, I think I'm brave enough to. Yes.
The name for the sunflowers in your language?
I would say Schmekel is what we use for sunflowers. Schmekel.
How many people can still speak the language like you do?
In my house, I was raised, my mother came from here, and she spoke two dialects. She spoke Shilstin, which is Okanagan, and she spoke Wenatchee. In my house, until I was third grade maybe, I spoke, because I was the only child at home, I spoke my native language. My mother played a game with me. She would ask me a question in Okanagan, and I'd answer her in Methow. She'd ask me a question in Wenatchee, and I'd answer her in Okanagan. But anyway, I went to a public school, and you got excited and you forgot your place. Native came out because it was primarily my first language. Wild Indian kind of stuck. But to answer your question, there are schools that are provided. My sister Lane heads one of them, and my experience with the language was very limited, I guess, after that. And I can get by, and that's about all. I'm not prevalently a speaker, but it's surprising what you retain. You go down the road or be on a horse or a piece of equipment, and a word will come in your head, and you wonder, what the hell is it? And it bothers you all day. What the hell does it? And it's the simplest word in the world. It's because we're forgetting language.
When you went up the Lost River with Schmekel, did you guys have horses with you, or were you walking?
I would say they were horseback primarily, because you could see Schmekel, he's aboard a horse, and behind him he has a Chevrolet sports car sitting back there.
Can you say more about the bead and leather work? Was that like something that was done during the winter?
Probably, because my mother worked on this. We were tanning hides. She probably tanned hides about this time of the year, because in the summertime the hides got the moisture, because she brain tanned them, and the moisture made the hide harder. So we waited till about this time of the year before we started. Not in weather like this, but I mean in at least 70-degree weather or 60-degree weather, because otherwise the hides became hard. And my mother preferred, here's something I should mention. My mother preferred, it was her partay, I guess, because she would see work. You see the gold color? She preferred everything from the goat wool area, because she said the texture of the cottonwood gave it a different texture. This is something from the Okanagan. She says, you see this every day. But she says, this is my introduction. You get that gold color, and she wanted that particular variety. And I go, you got cottonwood growing along the river here. And she says, no, I want that because this is what she wanted. So we came up and retrieved it. Came clear up here to haul Rottenwood home. But, you know, that was something she preferred. That's something she worked on.
You still ride horseback?
Oh, yeah, we still chase cows. And I got a Japanese quarter horse. You know, once in a while you can't catch that cow. That Yamaha comes in handy on That 2.5 gallons goes all day. That quarter horse gives up after a mile. See, those scabs are now healing up. Yeah, because with us, you're wheat farming. You got alfalfa. You got cows. Your time is limited. Instead of taking a horse and spending 2.5 hours to move strays out of the way, shut a gate, up there and back.
What kind of pickup you drive?
I got 2 old pickups. I got an old '74 pickup I've had since I went to high school, and I got an old Ford Ranger that I run around every day. Years ago, my mom and my father told a story. There was an old lady that lived in Mons, and down the way by Okanagan, there was another elderly lady. One spoke Wenatchee, one spoke Shilsha Okanagan. And she said, when you bring them up here to dig or pick berries, you have to referee. They get up here digging and they get jealous or mad. They get to arguing and fighting, and they wrestle. And they're picking huckleberries along this irrigation canal below Winthrop. There's a cutoff road there. The sabbathberry grows there. And they'd be picking there, and they'd get into a contest, and they'd roll down to the highway. And my mom and dad would go with the referee, and they'd both stand up, Shawindam, and Chantioctum. She says, what they're saying is, let me go, we're fighting. Yeah, the Indians had a number of not a religion, it was something they practiced. They always said the only thing that lasts forever is rocks. A lot of us, I seen my parents do it to a degree. They'd wake up in the morning. We're not talking a crack of dawn, for crying out loud. We're civilized individuals, And the sun would come up, and they'd greet the sun by opening their hands and casting over your head. When the moon come up, we call it the Schmekel, meaning the moon. They would do the same thing. They would greet the moon with open hands and cast it over. What else do we have? Yes?
What's your greatest wish for the Methow?
I think the next years would be quite interesting because we have to evolve. The stories I'm telling you, we'd never see, It's like the popularity of the modern West that only lasted 23 years, but we have movies, books. We had a number of people who were a little on the outside of the law, and in later lives they said, well, how could you shoot? They said, it's easy to shoot anything. It's easy, And the thing that came across to us and any notable person in history, we had a few people that were a little on the rough side. They said the thing we liked about it, or enthused us, it's when you shot somebody. It was how they danced. In their death throes, they would stand there and dance, or they tried to prepare themselves. They said it wasn't the killing. Killing didn't mean nothing. It was how a person would jump. But, those were the people who were a little far crazy, I guess. But these people disappeared, They were found weeks later, months later along the trail. People told them they just went camping and never came back. Because there was always people out there to take care of the bad people. Back in the day, it isn't like it is now, where you go to town and you see the sheriff's truck parked in front of the Pizza Hut, and it's pizza night. They're loading 300 pizzas to go to the jail. And you go, what's wrong with this picture? Or you're going to the pharmacy and you got to wait in line because this prisoner's getting his prescription filled. And you're paying with cash, and you go, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with this picture.
Is there anyone actively documenting a lot of the stories and the knowledge of the elders, or it's actually being put down in some kind of...
A lot of it, the stuff that we've been hearing is maybe by tapes from somebody that recorded it. My sister does a lot of the documentation, transferring tapes, but here, I think because this valley has been probably not discovered because of the isolation. Because if you look at the Methow entrance, you don't think there's nothing there. Because every discovery person came up here that traveled the Okanagan looked upon it like the lake, river, because they saw Antioch River first. And they saw it and they said, well, it'll meander up the river 4 or 5 miles and it'll peter out to bottom. They didn't realize that this came up into a whole different world. I mean, this is God's country. I mean, we come up here because we worship the mountains, because this is God's country. I mean, God touched this ground. I mean, regardless of who you call God, we call him culmination. I mean, the maker. We call him. He made this ground. I mean, look at this. The water. The water's the attraction here. The water. Life's got to evolve. It has to change. You can't be everlasting because you'll get stagnant. Changes are because we're human. I mean, we change every day, even though we're in the same situation. We use different methods to do things and different methods of operation because you're changing every day and you're self-educating yourself in new methods. And maybe possibility this won't work because sure in hell that didn't work, you know. For a long time, the Methow tribe has never been really recognized. They were saying that we weren't here. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Up and down this valley, there are paintings on a wall that depicts different things. We believe back in our folklore, and this travels back to begin the time, we believed in this Hatamuhut, or it's a god or a critter. In our belief, and you're going to snicker because we believe that there was a bird that flowed this country. It breathed fire and it flowed. It didn't distinguish between man and animal because he had to eat. Up the valley, there's a depiction because the anthropologists have said early man drawed what he saw. There's a depiction of a bird breathing fire and he could fly. And that's why a lot of us over the years have thought of Goat Wall as a very religious site because of the Hatamatut. Because if you look up the valley, as they told the story, the Hatamatut stood out, sat up on that rock that stood out. If you look up, Goat Wall stands out into the valley. He sat up there and he flowed. He flowed this entire valley. And he sat up there. If I wasn't scared of heights, I was wondering, I wonder if there's a feather, chunk of egg, bone, you know, but we're talking like 600-700 years, you know, there's probably nothing there, but you always wonder, I wonder. But that is some of the folklore that we grew up with. Oh, 5 minutes after the hour. Thank you. Thank you very much.
As a board, when we started talking about this 20 years ago, every year nonprofits get together and they say, imagine this, imagine that. We write things down. This was one of our imaginations. Oh.